So I think everyone would have joined our session by now. Good morning and afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our panel today on innovative solutions and affordable financing to bridge the digital divide. My name is Charmaine Bouvet. I am the Senior Public Policy Director and Growth Lead for Africa Cisco. And I am also one of the members. I'm a commissioner for the South African Presidential 4IR Commission. It's an honor to have you all with me and the panelists this afternoon. I will introduce you to our esteemed group of panelists in a little while, who will be unpacking and discussing their various technology solutions and affordable financing options, which they are leading to bridge the digital divide across Africa. Now, we heard from the previous panels around how COVID brought home the stark reality that has always been suggested by technology experts, that every organization, every government will have to digitize sooner rather than later. We see how Africa's leaders have shared various plans, various policies, various strategies aimed at achieving visions of prosperity for citizens through digital inclusion. And of course, leaders have also cautioned that we cannot afford for Africa to be left behind. And we heard the same time and time again that Africa's time is now. We also heard from previous panels how the continent has a youthful population and worrying rising unemployment rates impacting specifically the youth and women. So what solutions are therefore available to include Africa's youth and women in its digital adoption roadmap and journeys? The digital skills divide in Africa is real. And of course, we've seen that we need to develop digital natives who will reimagine Africa's digital future and ensure that the most vulnerable are not left behind. And of course, we keep bumping across real issues like affordability, like access, skills, which are all vital to bridging the digital divide across the continent. And of course, the one thing that is clear is that meaningful participation by all citizens is required to enable a true digital economy, yet digital access is currently not equally available to all citizens across the continent, especially those in rural areas. Now, over to our esteemed panelists who will unpack what their respective organizations are doing to support governments across the continent achieve their digital objectives. So our panelists consist of Lauren Binek, who is the Digital Inclusion Advisor for U.S. Agency for International Development Aid. So we also have Lydia Karoon, who's the Business Operations Manager for Airband International at Microsoft. We have Alex Fortescue, who is the Senior Manager for Africa Maxar. We have Brian Karaoke, who is the director on the board of Mawinga Networks. And of course, finally, Mark Rotter, who is the general manager for Africa for Adaptrum. So I'm going to kick off with you, Lauren. Maybe talk us through, what do you see US governments support for public-private partnerships across the continent actually looking like? Maybe talk us through that.
Sure. Thanks, Charmaine. And thank you for letting me join the panel today. Looking forward to the discussion. As highlighted in some of the opening comments by Leslie Marbury, through the US government's different agencies and departments, there's a whole host of ways that we're supporting public and private actors to help build ICT infrastructure. I believe she said there's at least 75 different trade and investment tools. So quite an array of opportunity to build infrastructure that's safe, secure, reliable, and inclusive for all segments of the population. These include USAID's policy, capacity building and partnership programs, USTDA's feasibility studies, financing from our Export-Import Bank or the International Development Finance Corporation, just to name a few. Of course, I can't go through all 75. So we internally at the US government are working together to try and share information on different project opportunities and coordinating the alignment of our resources for ICT infrastructure. Let me name a couple of examples. Leslie this morning already began discussing Prosper Africa, a wonderful US government-wide initiative to support trade and investment between the US and Africa. Another partnership across the US government that I want to mention, working with partner governments and the private sector, is the Digital Connectivity and Cybersecurity Partnership, or DCCP. This is also a whole of US government initiative that's focused on emerging market countries and building broadband connections, strengthening transparent regulatory policies for an open, competitive ICT market, and strengthening cybersecurity capacity. So you can see that there's a number of ways internally the US government is working together on these efforts and partnering with countries across the continent and with the private sector and civil society. I would highlight what Leslie mentioned, that there are deal teams at every embassy across the continent that's there as a resource to help navigate which parts of the US government might be able to support a local government or private sector. So let me end with one example of how USAID is implementing a program under the Digital Connectivity and Cybersecurity Partnership to specifically support private sector investment for connectivity. We recently launched a new program called Digital Invest, which is a partnership program looking to work with fund managers in the digital connectivity and fintech sectors. So we're looking to partner with others and use USAID's role as a donor agency and a catalyst for brokering relationships in this space, for catalyzing additional private sector resources into sectors where we need to continue to experiment with new technologies and new business models to showcase the profitability and the viability of last mile connectivity. So this partnership program is just now getting off the ground, but we're looking forward to announcing new partnerships with fund managers for both internet service providers and fintech investments.
Awesome. Thank you, Lauren. And I think you raised such a valid point just around the importance of organizations actually building a solid business case to be able to go out and do that initial research. So maybe, Brian, I'm going to pop in and have a conversation with you. I think Lauren has unpacked some remarkable programs that are out there, but to bring that closer to home, do you have any examples that you can cite where maybe an organization that you are with has actually benefited from this type of a grant, or you've seen this come to life?
Thanks, Charmaine, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone that's with us today. I'll start off by just giving a quick overview of Mawingu, who we are, and then I'll come to your question. And I do have some specific examples that I can speak to. So as you had said in the introduction, I am a director on the board at Mawingu. And Mawingu is a business based in Kenya. And we build sustainable radio infrastructure to deliver the internet where fiber and mobile networks either cannot reach or are too expensive. And really the insight that led to the founding of Mawingu was that Western connectivity models will not get Africa online. If you look at broadband penetration per every 100 people, which is always a great measure to see to what extent quality internet is being made use of in certain places. In Europe, there are about 35 broadband connections for every 100 people today. And in sub-Saharan Africa, that figure stands at just under one, less than one broadband connection for every 100 people. And if we were to extend Western connectivity models, what has been used in the West to get people online, if we were to extend that across Africa to get broadband penetration to the same level, we would need to deploy about $2 trillion worth of resources in order to achieve that. And that's obviously not feasible, not anytime soon, at least. And a different solution was therefore required. And the solution that we have been working hard to deploy is really built around the technology that is fixed wireless internet, which uses low-cost radio equipment, can be erected in days, and enables us to serve people in really, really unserved areas. We're talking about really rural areas. So essentially what we do is that we extend the last mile And because of how fiber has been deployed in Africa, while it is fiber connectivity does not get to most places in rural and peri-urban Africa, 60% of Africans do live within 25 kilometers of a fiber line. What that means is that fixed wireless internet is a viable solution to enable us to connect the majority of Africans to the internet. Now, obviously, in working to deploy this technology at scale, we do still need to deploy the sort of resources that would not be accessible to a startup, at least as we were a few years back. And the models that you are describing and that Lauren has spoken to now have been very useful for us. I'll give you an example. The first grant that Mawingu received, and Mawingu did actually begin as a grant-funded organization, was a grant in kind for solar panels from USAID. It was $150,000 worth of solar panels that we deployed. And that enabled us to set up our infrastructure, our base station infrastructure, in such a way that we could reach places that were completely off the grid. And that is a model that we have continued to deploy until today. We have received support from a number of organizations, a number of governmental organizations. We are currently in discussions with the USCDA about feasibility study to enable us to understand which areas across Kenya and in Eastern Africa would make sense for us to expand to. We've worked with the International Development Finance Corporation, which a few years back, really based on the support that we had received from Microsoft, enabled us to expand from the initial grant-funded pilot that I just described to you now. So there are a number of instances and projects where we have benefited from such funding. And that enables us to really create a viable commercial model built off of the back of this technology to enable us to serve underserved areas. What I'm describing is what is often termed nowadays a blended finance approach. And that's precisely what is needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. And I think you've actually taken the conversation perfectly into the next phase, just around, and I've noticed both from you and Lauren, the really heavy emphasis, and I think from all of the speakers around the focus on the underserved areas. So I'm going to come to you, Lydia. Maybe can you talk us through around how can we really effectively collaborate from US government to US industries to partners on the ground to actually enable us to expand rural connectivity. So how do we increase connectivity, especially in the underserved areas? What have you seen work for you?
Yeah, thank you so much, Charmaine, and thanks for having me today. I'll give a little bit of background in the same way that Brian did about the Airband initiative, and then talk about our approach to partnership and how a really core part of that is public-private partnership and access to financing for our partners to allow them to scale and actually create sustainable businesses. So as Charmaine said, I work on the Airband initiative team, which is a team that's focused on affordable access to energy and internet out of Microsoft. And we do this through a partnership model, which I think is really key. Microsoft and the Airband team fully recognize that we cannot be the experts on the ground in every market that we go into, or quite frankly, in any market that we go into. So we really need to support local businesses who are innovating in the connectivity and energy access space. So we do that through partnering with equipment manufacturers, internet and energy access providers, and then local entrepreneurs who are coming up with innovative solutions around education, agriculture, and digital equity. And the goal of all that is to make affordable broadband a reality. And when we work internationally, when we say affordable broadband, we really mean to rural, and underserved areas, since that's the area where we see the largest gap. And really people, not only is the internet not affordable, as Brian highlighted, oftentimes it's not even an option. And so how do we support partners to expand their networks? So we've developed a strategic approach over the years. The initiative is about 5 years old, but we have been working in Africa, and actually specifically with Mawingu, who was our first partner on the airband side, for over 7 years. So have been working in this space for quite a while. And we really focus on bringing together public and private sector organizations to help address the broadband gap and make it easier and more affordable to get online. So I want to be clear when I say public and private sector, this is, government organizations, NGOs, but then also private sector partners. I think a lot of tech companies have the same goal, which is to bring more people online affordably. And if we can do that by collaborating together, we're all for it since the end result is the same. We have publicly announced goals. So by July 2022, we've committed to covering 3 million people in the rural US with internet coverage, and then 40 million people with internet coverage internationally. Although, we know the scope of the problem with access is much larger than 40 million, we really felt that it was important to put a stake in the ground that allowed us to measure our progress and really invest more heavily to work towards that goal, with the goal, of eventually, hopefully amplifying that even more and increasing the market footprint of our partners. So like I said, we partner with companies like Mawingu, and we really approach our partnership in sort of a fourfold way. So the first is regulatory and government involvement. So whenever we're working with a partner, how do we make sure that whatever projects we're doing align to the needs of the local government and the priorities of the local government? So whether that be, education, I think obviously increasingly with COVID, we've seen a huge demand for telehealth and telemedicine. So how do we make sure we're working with government, US government, and then other government agencies, and especially local government, to prioritize the needs of the country? The next piece, obviously, is the partnership piece. We are never the boots on the ground deploying networks. We really need strong partners in the markets that we work in who understand the local market. And we try to give our partners a lot of leeway to come to us and say, we've actually seen hotspots maybe didn't work in the past, but with COVID, we've seen a huge uptick or something along those lines. So really trying to be both technology and approach agnostic and letting our partners drive the growth and scale of their own companies, with obviously technology and resource support from Microsoft. The next piece, and I think that this is really key, is something that we call digital transformation. We recognize that connectivity is just a means to an end. So how do we support our partners to actually create a strong value proposition with connectivity, using either resources, local resources, or tools within Microsoft to make sure that we are always building in value add? So whether that be through agriculture work or, like I said, telehealth or education, how do we really help our partners build out those initiatives and those parts of their work? And then the last piece, and I think that this is really key to this conversation, is access to financing. We as Microsoft are obviously not a bank. And so how do we help our partners access those large buckets of financing when they're ready to move, like Mawingu did, beyond pilot scale to, actually commercial deployment, when they're ready to move beyond just small buckets of funding and, start to get millions, if not tens of millions. So we do that through working with government agencies like USAID, USTDA, Millennium Challenge Corporation, DFC, and really making sure that we are presenting our partners as a pipeline to enhance their work, and then also to use their expertise in the field to help our partners continue to grow in a sustainable way.
Awesome. Thank you, Lydia. And I think, again, what is coming out so strongly for me throughout the entire thread of this conversation is the importance of collaboration, the importance of partnerships. So maybe, Lauren, you can just touch very briefly, just in terms of some of these key partnerships, and I think how you have seen these actually unfold and how they have been able to, in turn, I think, connect the smaller parts to create a bigger part for the continent.
Yeah, sure. I can jump in with an example of what this has looked like in the past for a specific country. following the Ebola outbreak of 2014 to 2016, USAID was working in West Africa, and specifically in Liberia in 2017, we decided to partner with C-Squared and Google to help support building a stronger ICT infrastructure that became apparent was weak in the Ebola response, and wanted to build back stronger for future emergencies and for everyday life. So we partnered with C-Squared. It was a $12 million 50-50 co-investment between C-Squared and USAID to help. USAID's role was really brokering and de-risking this investment for C-Squared and helping to build out 200 kilometers of high-speed metro fiber to Monrovia. This connected government offices, healthcare facilities, businesses to the internet. And so you can start to see how then we can build out from that initial partnership. C-Squared can continue its operations once USAID is able to help come in, de-risk a market that they may not have otherwise entered at that period of time, and to continue to build out their operations in the region, while USAID continued to partner with the government to build out additional digital skills building activities, trainings, partnering with the government and the regulatory body on building out additional broadband plans for more rural communities, helping support capacity building within the government, within the business sector, within the healthcare sector, to start utilizing broadband connections and digital technology into the work. So you can see how partnering with the private sector to bring that infrastructure, but then to overlay onto the internet, other things that is able to accelerate.
Awesome. And I love the very clear picture that you have created. And I think, Brian, what becomes so important here again is those frameworks for government. And I think both Lydia and Lauren, you've touched so beautifully just around the importance, I think, that we've seen during the COVID period around the digital health clinics, also around digital education. But I think also, Brian, we're picking up more and more that spectrum is becoming a really big issue. How have you addressed this in the rural areas to ensure that footprint and coverage? Over to you, Brian.
Thank you. Well, yes, I can speak to specific projects that we have run to do so that are quite similar to what Lauren has just described in terms of public-private partnerships to increase digital participation, right, and not just the reach of digital in rural areas. And one particular project that comes to mind is one that we rolled out in response to the outbreak of the COVID epidemic last year, where it became very clear that, not just here, but across the world, that in order for communities and for governments to respond and for health systems to be responsive to the COVID outbreak, that they really needed to get connectivity to as many places as they could, to every single response point and point of presence for health organizations, and that's precisely what happened here. And really, just to bring it home, we had so Mawingu is based in a county called Laikipia in Kenya, and Laikipia County is home to 85 health clinics, county health clinics, which are spread out around quite a large geographical area. And as soon as this epidemic, it became clear that it was an epidemic, we reached out to the county government here in Laikipia, really just to understand how we could support them in their efforts to respond to the COVID crisis. And as I said, connectivity became the one thing that we could do. But in order for us to deploy our connectivity to all of these far-reaching places, we needed to raise a fair bit of money. And we were glad for the support that we received from Microsoft and their Airband initiative, because really what that enabled us to do is to unlock other sources of funding, including those from government or state-like entities, such as what was then called, which is now called the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office of the UK government. That enabled us to connect to roll out a project to connect every single clinic in Laikipia County to the internet. And having done that, that obviously enabled the government themselves to not just layer on services in response to COVID, but also the typical sort of health service offering that you would expect from a county or a public facility, right? That aims to serve all of the citizens in that area. Just to give you an idea of the impact of this project, in Laikipia County, as I said, there are 85 clinics, but there are only 200 doctors in this entire county and about 800 nurses. They serve a population of just over half a million people. There are only 2 hospitals in Laikipia County. Two level 3 hospitals, which is 2 hospitals of the sort of quality that you would expect from a county level facility. And the best medical resources end up being concentrated in these facilities, not just the doctors, but medicines and what have you. And the citizens know this. So anybody who falls ill would rather pay the transport fees to get to the towns where these hospitals are located. So even without COVID, there's a severe bottleneck created in these facilities, and rural patients are fortunate if they are ever seen by a doctor, right? And with COVID, obviously, and the lockdowns that were necessitated, these people struggle to get care. Having rolled out, so that's the before picture. Now, based on the support that we received from Microsoft Airband and what came from FCDO and the other partners that we were able to bring together, having rolled out connectivity to these centers, the county now is able to make use of teleconferencing platforms, right, such as the one that we are on today, for remote consultations, so that remotely located patients can be seen by quality doctors without having to travel. The other thing that happens is that the health centers are then plugged into inventory management systems so that the county can keep track of medicine levels remotely and can replenish them far more efficiently. And obviously what all of that means is that the centrally located senior health officials, because all of these people are located centrally, and that's how the facilities are run, are able to better manage their network of health centers. So that's just an idea of the impact that was unlocked by the participation of the different people that came together to enable us to roll out such a program.
Awesome. Absolutely remarkable. And I think, Alex, I'm coming over to you. I think with the example cited by Lauren, by Brian, by Lydia, around the processes that most governments and US firms have to go through to work with agencies, I think a very important point that often pops up for me when governments start to put their heads together to collaborate on their digital plans, I think an important aspect to tie the threads together always starts with thought leadership. So how are you and your organization actually collaborating, working with the different government entities and associations to provide that thought leadership so that governments are able to deliver on solid digital plans to then get to that point of financing and to then get to that point of collaborating with these phenomenal case studies that have been cited? Over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Charmaine, and good morning and afternoon to the audience. Charmaine, just to give you a background, I represent Maxar in Africa, based here in South Africa. We really provide Earth observation, satellite imagery, space and ground infrastructure. And when people hear about digitize, they think about connectivity. For me, digitize means actually physically digital mapping and creating the information base. There was examples about Ebola. When these disasters break out, how do you respond? Where is everyone? You need this baseline information. And perhaps one example I could give is some work that started with a project in Nigeria with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They had a polio vaccination program. Largely, there's no polio in Nigeria anymore, thanks to the BMGF. But they needed to map each and every building. Africa is largely unmapped. And so it turned out that by taking some of these vials, that they would either expire. If there were 1,000 people in a village on a map and there were only 3 people actually physically there, there was creating havoc in their planning. And so we worked with BMGF and other partners. We've got this massive repository of imagery. Work with partners using AI technology, cloud and crowd really, and AI, to automatically map each and every building in Nigeria to help the planning. And the project was so successful that Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation sponsored us to produce a data set of each and every building in Africa last year. That was produced in a matter of months. And as it stands today, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation grantees are eligible to use that data at no cost. I know that I just spoke this morning with a number of energy partners. These are people working on rural electrification programs, and it's all about least cost routing. You know, where's the closest place we can electrify? And again, that same data set is being used across the board, even for census mapping. So we've got a number of partners in Africa where we're assisting them gaining access to these types of data sets, which have been sponsored through donor agencies like BMGF. So that's just one example of how we're trying to help create the data or help Africa bridge the digital divide in terms of accessing those fundamental base data sets and trying to assist on the financing side too.
Absolutely. And I think it starts off, there for us to be able to build that credible database and that data set to be able to pass it on to the next person to take the baton. So Mark from Adaptrum, maybe you can also just share with us a bit about Adaptrum and some of the thought leadership efforts you have also seen the company step in with government and an ecosystem of stakeholders to also see how we actually assist just in terms of bridging the digital divide across the continent.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to speak. And good morning, good afternoon to everyone. It's really interesting listening to the sort of the color that Brian gives to the real world, the problems and challenges and how do you decide things. And I think COVID in general sort of called everyone's bluff a bit worldwide, not just in Africa, everywhere, right? It just everyone's plans, neatly laid plans were somewhat disrupted. Let's put it like that, right? And also it clearly emphasized what problems we must solve and what problems are not as urgent. I'm not saying we have a solution for the problems we must solve, but certainly the discussion or the seriousness of the discussion around what's a difficult problem to solve and how to solve a problem is now significantly deeper than it was before. And so, I mean, I'd love to touch, I think Mawingu is a great example of working our way through as a partnership of large companies, governments, regulators, individuals, vendors, service providers, or the whole team kind of, okay, how do we figure out this problem and what does that solve and how do we figure out that problem? And we learn things, right? So as Adaptrum, I'll say in the room in front of me, I see Lauren from USAID. As Adaptrum, we benefited from a grant to Adaptrum in Botswana many years ago, 5 years ago, I think. We did a TV white space project on telemedicine there through NetHope. I think it was a USAID NetHope arrangement. And that helped us to learn some of the examples Brian gave about telemedicine that helped us to understand some of this and the challenges, right? And unlocked certain things and said, okay, here's the next level of problem that we still need to solve, right? Another grant that we received now most recently is a $1 million USTA grant for South Africa. And we really had the freedom there to say, okay, what are the problems? We made a list of 20 problems and we sort of looked at them. I think everybody understands that it's really hard to do rural connectivity. And also that it isn't just connectivity. You can't solve connectivity. You have to solve the whole value chain, right? You have to look at all of the bits and pieces together. And as soon as you try and, provide laptops to schools, but they don't have internet, then 6 months from now, they don't have the correct curriculum anymore. And they don't have, they don't have the right version of the operating system anymore, And so the sort of comment on unlocking financing, I think is also critical, right? So we've also benefited from not just from Microsoft investment in Adaptrum. We're a small company out of San Jose, and we have we don't have a global workforce, but Microsoft has been amazing at supporting us. It's just, and that partnership between what Microsoft's able to do and unlocking, therefore, USTDA exposing us to some of those USAID, etc., has been incredibly useful, right? And so, and then also Brian mentioned FCDO in the FCDO project in Kenya. It's really interesting. So that the fact that the next round of projects in Kenya have really benefited from US involvement and UK government involvement in some of those things, and iterating and learning about how to do that involvement on a better and better basis, I think is that's the way we're going to solve some of these. We need to say, it needs the equipment. As a vendor, I'll put myself on point. Equipment needs to be much cheaper than it is currently, right? Brian is going to smile when I say that. Okay, it just has to be, right? So how do we do that? Okay, one of the ways we can do that is we can, the Microsoft Magic Fairy can wave its wand and can say, we have 50 patents. We've got 50 people who got doctorates on TV whitespace. Why don't you just take that and do something magic with it? Okay, that was awesome. We owe some of our existence to that, right? It's amazing that Microsoft, open sourced that and gave a permanent license for us to be able to do that, right? And I know Cisco, you guys do similar things, right? You get involved in disaster recoveries. I've got friends who do TV whitespace projects where there's always a Cisco guy on the project as well. So it is understanding this whole value chain. Digital content, absolutely. We had some unrest, unfortunately, in South Africa a short while ago, and the first thing I tried to do was to look at if we have something like Ushahidi in South Africa. Ushahidi does a mapping of hotspots and for elections and so on. And Maxar, exactly what you described, that sort of availability and ability to see and understand what's happening is significantly important, right? And I think that we'll see a combination through these partnerships, through smart, affordable financing. I think that's a key thing, right? We're not going to make it free, but we need to figure out the cost of financing as an element of affordability, the cost of spectrum as an element of affordability, the cost of devices as an element, the cost of digitization, digital and skills and learning, all of those things as an element of affordability. So projects like Giga, super exciting initiative in terms of schooling. Can we learn lessons from Giga and from what USAID and USTDA and others are doing, X and MCC, in terms of getting it to every man on the street, because they need to educate themselves to understand how do we deal with COVID, which vaccine, all of those things are things that one can, you can learn from, right? How do we address fake news, right? Not by removing all news, but by educating, right? All of those things have to come together. So, yeah.
Absolutely spot on. I love it. And I think, Mark, I love how you've unpacked and you've actually just taken apart that critical value chain with the whole host of stakeholders who are so critical, again, in contributing to addressing this digital divide. And I think you've touched on an important aspect that the Minister of Digital Communications and Technology earlier touched on around the unrest in South Africa that devastated the country last week. And she touched again on a very important aspect of the youth, who is such a growing entity across the continent. And I think an important question then we come across to you, Lydia, is how are we ensuring, I think, that we are developing Africa's youth and females to ensure that they are not left behind? I think more so SMMEs during this period. And I think Mark has also alluded to the fact that they are such an important component, especially from a cost aspect. How are we ensuring inclusion of Africa's youth and females?
Yeah, so I'll touch on one brief example, and then I know that Lauren can elaborate on this as well, since it was a project, or it is a project that we've been working on together. And I know Brian will have something to add too. The deck is a little stacked in my favor on this call. So as Airband, we have been partnering with USAID. We announced a partnership in August 2020 to provide funding for projects focused specifically on addressing the digital gender divide. And, I think that this is a really good example, of private and public sector collaboration, but also of motivating other private sector partners to join and take action as well. So this funding goes to 6 airband partners, 3 of whom are on the African continent. So Mawingu is a recipient of some of the funding in Kenya. A company that we invested in a number of years ago called M-Copa also is doing a project. And then one of our partners, Bluetown, is focusing their work in Ghana. And again, like I said, this funding is specifically for projects that are focused on addressing the digital gender divide. But I think one of the really interesting learnings that came out of this, even as we moved from sort of the first stage of the project to the second stage, is obviously how different the barriers in each market are and how different the enablers are. So I think one of the really strong things about this partnership is we're able to harness Microsoft's technical expertise as well as partnerships and scale opportunities. And then obviously USAID's expertise in markets and with issues of gender, based on some work that they have done previously leading up to this. So we really just view this as an initial catalyst in the space and hope to grow our work around addressing the digital gender divide, since obviously if we are ignoring 50% of the population in the markets that we go into or not trying to consciously reach 50% of the population, from a business perspective, our partners are missing out on a commercial opportunity. And then from an airband perspective, if we talk about value add, if we're not consciously trying to incorporate women and girls and youth into that conversation, we're really not living our mission.
Thank you very much. Awesome. And Lauren, I believe you've got a very brief example you would like to cite just in terms of how to ensure we're not leaving our youth and women behind.
Sure. Yeah, I think this is great. Obviously, we've talked a lot about internet expansion, but it's so much more than networks. It's also about making sure that internet connections, once they reach a community, they're functional and they can be used by all segments of the population. So the gender digital divide, a huge issue, especially with more and more services in light of COVID and just ongoing trends becoming digital. If we don't address the gender digital divide, we're at risk of further exacerbating gender inequalities around the world. In sub-Saharan Africa, the gender digital divide in mobile phone ownership is 13%. And when it comes to mobile internet, it's 37%. So a lot of the work that led us to this partnership with Microsoft Airband and has informed our approach to the partnership was through our Women Connect Challenge. USAID put out a global call for solutions to really improve women's participation in everyday life by addressing their access and use of digital technology. So around the world, we have 16 Women Connect Challenge winners who are collectively working to overcome barriers in access and use of technology. And together we'll connect nearly 6 million women. As an example, on the African continent, we're working with AFCHICS, which is helping rural women to run local internet service providers and work as network engineers. Our work with them is helping support their programming in Kenya, Namibia, Senegal, and Morocco. And it's just a great example of both expanding ICT infrastructure and addressing the gender digital divide by engaging women in bringing the internet to communities. You're establishing those norms from the start, right when broadband connections are being established.
I love that. And I think you make an important point around the digital skills gap and how that is widening. And maybe, Alex, before I get to Brian, do you have some real life examples just around what are different companies actually doing to address this digital skills gap? Because it's all good and well to bring everybody along, but to bring everybody along and to ensure true digital inclusion, skills, I guess, is quite critical.
Yeah, thanks, Charmaine. I mean, particularly in our space, right? I mean, we're using, we've amassed 100 petabytes of data, which is sitting on the cloud. I don't know that a student in Africa has really been able to access that kind of system, whereas in the US, obviously, students are accessing that system on a daily basis. And so what we've done is worked very closely with government agencies, in particular the South African Space Agency, and created a space tech challenge, where we try and encourage youth through startup companies to put forward ideas on how to use scale our imagery and applications at scale to map solutions in Africa. And so that's working really well. We're in about our 5th year now, and look out on the SANZA website, the South African National Space Agency website, for the next challenge. But we find that by partnering with other companies like ourselves, software companies, digital access companies, the prizes are really enabling, and also through another partner, Reese, those winners are not only exposed to the technology side, but also to investors, and also getting skills on how to pitch to investors. So there's a really full suite of skills development that occurs not only on the tech side, but also on selling a startup package to an investor as well. Thank you.
Got it. And I love it. And I think there's this big focus on SANZA right now. And I think it's great to see how, for the first time, we actually seeing them take the lead in terms of getting innovation out there. And I think, Mark, maybe for you, I'm hearing Alex talk about these competitions. Are they finding their way into the rural areas?
My answer is yes and no, right? And I think that the reality is that the reason for the yes is, we're sort of waves of expansion, right? We're seeing that. And the hardest areas are probably always going to be those that are really far away and, where there's no other infrastructure to get there. And that's directly a cost element, right? So how do you, and so the more rural we get, the more important it is to really think about long-term financing. And I asked myself, 100 years ago, we looked at building railway lines, and we said, this is going to pay off over 50 years. Who has an appetite at the moment for 50-year financing, right? It's a tough question, So, and some of that is, I must just say, from my minimum experience when I started the USTDA project in South Africa, there were some challenges the way I just thought, right, I don't know, the variability of the South African rand is, in terms of its overall range, is quite big. So that makes it challenging for OEMs to import equipment at a stable rate. Okay, and because of the introduction of EXIM, there was kind of a win-win financing scenario where that risk factor ended up being zeroed out. Okay. So affordable financing is not just about giving somebody less interest. It's also about, or maybe even more importantly, about thinking really smart about what the problems are, and are there parties that you can put together in the value chain that will make the whole value chain work, right?
Yeah.
So I think that we're still a ways off, and it's a big problem. But I think that one of the things that I think is really important is affordable financing. And I just also want to say, we've really enjoyed working with CA as a regulator in Kenya. Generally, CA has been very open to being open to trying new things and different models, right? Which may be complex from a bureaucracy point of view, but willing to try it, right? So their whole getting to the most rural of rural is always going to have some aspect of community networks and skills in community networks. And CA has now developed a set of regulations specifically simplifying all of the other regulations that apply to telecommunications operators for community networks. I think that's tremendous. And that partnership, somebody like Mawingu, somebody like Microsoft, USAID, USTDA, FCDO, kind of figuring out, okay, how do we get to put those bits together so that we have the whole value chain stretching all the way into the most rural areas? I think that's going to be a critical part of the solution.
Absolutely. And I think, Lauren, I'm just going to dip in quickly to some of the audience questions. We've got a lovely one, I think, that I actually also be keen in terms of a response to, from Jairo Rivera, who's a VP of Sales for eTech Simulation. So they're asking for smaller ICT projects, example, those ranging from $200K to $2 million, what finance instruments would actually work best in Africa?
I'm happy to jump in with some initial thoughts.
Sure.
I don't know if that was directed
Please,
at me. From at least the US government's set of tools and resources, I outlined a whole array of ways to kind of explore ways that different parts of the US government can work together and sort of create that pipeline that others have talked about of helping to support that early stage financing and sort of bridge and work with early stage companies, at least early business model development, and sort of expand and grow up that financing chain to access additional debt and equity from other parts of the US government. I would say is a specific example, and it's something that still needs to be experimented with, right? Is this kind of equity in these types of companies? Is a debt product more appropriate? The partnership program I discussed at the top of the panel called Digital Invest, that's a call we put out to fund managers themselves. What are they seeing in the markets? What are they currently experimenting with? And what's the role that the US government can play in helping to experiment and work with that at the early stage to really build out what tools are most appropriate so that it can be scaled up and mainstreamed in the future.
Got it. Thank you very much. But and it does sound as well that I think a big portion of the financing is available, I think, through USTDAs, through grants, through some type of collaboration. But I think what you're saying is there are various of these 75 instruments, and one of them are going to cover, I think, this request. Anything else from any of the other panelists? So I can pop over to the next question. I think it's also quite a similar question from Eckhart, who's asking, in a mixed financing model, what is the experience of the panelists regarding what proportion of the costs can typically be covered by users through monthly subscriptions, especially when providing access to the underserved or low-income communities? So maybe, Mark, you can touch on that for us with the mixed model prescription.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. So one of the things we did in the USDA project is we built both a financial evaluation model as well as doing survey work to test affordability and a number of other questions for getting Wi-Fi hotspots in a number of different areas. We put up 30 hotspots in different areas, socioeconomic areas, and to kind of get a sense for what these. I'll give some numbers, and somebody will clobber me over the head with it later. But one of the things that we've sort of felt out of that, I would say as a summary of that, might be something like, if you look at $100 per month for hotspot as an income, then that seems to be something that we could make work, right? There's also a lesson from Mawingu, some of the work Mawingu did on a similar basis a long time ago, is that if you just do hotspots alone, as Lydia was saying, that's a really tough question. You've got to have some sort of anchor tenants to be able to cover some of that. Then we're also working on a project in one of the US states with the nice domestic grants now that have come out recently. And the ISP there told us, interestingly, that it's really helpful if you can have somebody take a portion of the capex out of the equation to make sure that the risk to the smaller WISP is lower, right? So it's actually the whole value chain again. I can't, blended financing, the whole value chain, right? Looking at all of the components is so critical, right? You've got to have a good core, you've got to, and edge and cloud, and there's all of these things that are going to help us do some of these things. It's a complex problem and obviously the further away you go, the harder the distance is to cover, the more you need to invest to get there, and that for me goes back to, in some ways, there's a opportunity to do building railroads kind of investments. We do have to think of that in the long term. I think it's putting those things together. But I hope, Eckhart, that gives you a kind of a one number which you can divide it by a number of users per month and then get a ARPU. But that allowed us to look at it from how much capex do we need to invest to get people to a certain point, and what do we need? What do we need to then monetize from that point? So balancing that out.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that, Mark. Any other comments just in terms of the questions? If anyone else wants to respond?
I think I'll just add one thing to what Mark has said, which is that one of the variables, if we're talking about business modeling, to understand what proportion of your costs can be met, let's say commercially, and then what proportion can be met non-commercially, is investment appetite, right? Which is the investors that you have, be that yourself or somebody that's funding the project or the business. How commercially viable, independently commercially viable, do they need the project to be? And often the case is, the answer to that question often is that they need it to be fully commercially viable, but at a certain point in time, right? And is that point in time a year or 5 years is really the question that one needs to answer. Because if it's in 5 years, then you can afford to be a bit more, let's say, commercially adventurous in the early years. Also depending on whether you're able to get people who are willing to meet the initial cost for deploying of infrastructure, as Mark has said, which are often the big ticket items, right? So it all really comes down to, at what point do you want this thing to be commercially viable? That's probably what will determine the proportion of the different types of financing that you will need for the project or the business.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that, Brian. And that actually brings us to the end of our panel conversation. So thank you very, very much to our panelists for that illuminating conversation on innovative solutions and affordable financing to bridge the digital divide. And I think one thing that came across very clearly from Lydia, from Alex, from Brian, from Mark, and from Lauren is that they are an ecosystem of stakeholders that are going to make this possible. Government cannot do this alone. And again, I think there are very important conversations to be led around the affordable financing that is available and for us to tap into these. And then, of course, I think also it came through very strongly just in terms of the thought leadership that starts on the ground and how to lead this in a collaborative partnership model with government. And I think most importantly, ensuring that the very critical elements of Africa's population, their youth and women, are not left behind, and that we continue to focus on expanding Africa's access to digital skills. And I think also, Mark just touched on something and reminded us that COVID really and truly brought home the fact that at some point in time, we are all going to have to digitize to ensure that we actually do provide citizens access to an equitable future that is digitized. So thank you everyone who actually joined us. So we now have 30 minutes on the workshop agenda for you to visit the exhibitors in the exhibit hall and to network with other attendees who are currently in the meeting hub as well. So thank you very much for joining us. And with that, me and our panel are actually off.